big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Lease.
Well, hi, everybody. It's September the 12th, 2024, the year of our Lord, and my name is David Lease. I'm the proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and we're so glad that you could all join us today for this live broadcast on some, as usual, very important topics. This one will be talking about the theme of education as our children go back to school. And before I dive into that topic, I did want to thank everyone for their comments. It's been really encouraging, your comments. And it's interesting, we have such a variety of people join us from across the country. And we'll try to give out shout outs to different people, and your questions are very welcome because everyone has a lot at stake when we look at our country today, the past, the choices that we face, and certainly in education, that's no exception. And so be sure to subscribe to the newsletter. We encourage you to even like what we're doing. If you like the program, that makes an impact in terms of its take-up, in terms of these mysterious algorithms that are in technology platforms and social media. So be sure to like us if you think you do like us, and share it. Get the word out. That's something that you can do, actually, as an action, as we think about our role as citizens in our great country of Canada. And there's a lot going on in our country. It's almost overwhelming some days, the amount of things that are going on. I know that yesterday we had the passing of the Manitoba Grand Chief. All of a sudden, I'm still learning more details about that. It's always a shock when someone passes away mysteriously. We've also had a major media conference again in Ottawa with the House of Commons, as we heard last week, as we talked about the so-called ripping up of the agreement, the supply agreement between the NDP and the Liberal Party of Canada. They were basically governing this country as a de facto coalition, working together, and depending on your point of view, destroying our country, making life more difficult. And I think that's the context, obviously, in which the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, called for the NDP not to support and keeping in power the Liberal Party. What do you think? Was that a good idea? I mean, we certainly had quite a discussion with the Honorable Dan Mattigue, a former Liberal cabinet minister, about that issue. And yesterday we had a media conference by the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, saying it's time for, I have a quote here, opposition leader Pierre Poilievre yesterday said he will compel the Commons to vote no confidence, that would bring the Liberal government down, in the House of Commons as soon as possible and send voters into a full election. It is, quote, put up or shut up time for the NDP, Pierre Poilievre said. What will it be? So that is the question. What do you think? Love to hear your opinion. So that's very interesting. Maybe the odds of an election do go up in light of that. The other thing I did want to mention is that it's fascinating. You may recall that this past year there has been an inquiry into the possibility of foreign interference in Canada's elections. This is a significant issue. And it's interesting, yesterday we learned, as reported by the Blacklock's reporter, that the inquiry yesterday confirmed it is recalling the Liberal Party executive, Azam Ashmale, who was the national director of the party's re-election in 2021 campaign. It has asked that individual to, that person has testified a number of times and stated he was unaware of any foreign interference. Quote, we have a lot of trust. So stay tuned on that file as the inquiry gets into the home stretch and will ultimately produce a final report. So I think that story is interesting. I just wanted to highlight that to you. So on September the 12th, We know that children across our incredible country are going back to school. And so we're going to talk about education, and we're going to specifically look at how we can gather advice together for parents. You may have questions for our next special guest. I'm very excited then to welcome our guest, Caylan Ford. So welcome, Caylan.
Thank you, David.
Caylan, you are one of my heroes. You are certainly a leader in education. You have an extensive background both in law, human rights, and history and philosophy. And I have very much admired your work as a leader to found, I think, some extraordinary schools in Alberta. They're specifically charter schools that are classical schools. And we're going to learn more about that and certainly seek your advice as an educator as parents walk with their children back to school. So I did want to start off with a really basic question, Caylan, and that is, why did you end up founding these schools? That's really quite an extraordinary undertaking.
So I think some of your audience members may recall our last conversation maybe a year ago, and some of my background comes from the study of, for a couple decades, I was very interested in the study of totalitarian systems and
Indeed.
with the problem of political and philosophical and by extension, I think, spiritual corruption and evil. And I'm concerned with how do we detect these tendencies in our own society, and how do we avoid the kind of fate that so many people in the 20th century fell into. And I think about maybe 10, 15 years ago, I started to notice that many of the qualities that I associated with totalitarian systems, or at least with proto-totalitarianism, were becoming more prevalent in our own society. And I started noticing this first in the symptoms. So things like, tearing down statues, renaming streets, the sort of stifling of open inquiry or dialectic that is sort of oriented towards seeking truth became increasingly difficult and verboten in some circles or on some topics. But those are just symptoms. So there are deeper underlying causes, and we can get into those. Mm-hmm. And the question then became, well, how can we sort of prevent this, or at least carve out a little bit of space where people still acquire the ability to discern sort of reasonably, where they can tell right from wrong, they can differentiate justice from injustice. And how do we educate people to be able to do that? So how do we inoculate people against this kind of philosophical error and political evil? And the answer, I think most obviously, and this is not a novel insight, is it's in education. So long story short, I ran for political office with that same understanding. This did not work out. But starting schools is sort of an attempt to do in microcosm what I kind of thought is necessary if we were going to try to preserve order and harmony and coherence as a civilization and as a society.
So this is a fascinating story. So Caylan, like myself, we studied history. And one of the lessons of history is you look at totalitarian regimes, the rule of tyranny. It kind of compelled you, if I understand your story well, that you said, look, I really think education is foundational and I want to do something about it. And you didn't just talk about it. You actually founded some really thriving schools now. That's essentially it, is it?
I hope that they're thriving, yes. Well, we've grown, this is now our third year of operation, and we have about 1,300 students across 3 campuses and wait lists more than double that number. So I think there's certainly a massive demand for what we're offering, and we hope to be able to continue expanding.
That's amazing. So just briefly then, so you've got 3 campuses. Where are they and how many students do you have?
So we opened in 2022 with one elementary school of about 290 students in Calgary. We still have that school, but then we expanded it to 2 additional campuses. One is in a former commercial office building in Edmonton, and another former military barracks in Calgary. And across all of those campuses, this year we're about 1,300 students from grades from kindergarten to grade 9, and we'll be growing up to grade 12 over the next 3 years.
So for you personally, what makes back to school time so exciting?
Oh, goodness. That's a great question. I'm so excited when I get to be in the schools and watch the learning that's happening and watch the community as it's coming together. There's something really unique about the culture in our schools. One of the things that we do is we have a lot of rituals that try to help with that enculturation piece. So, for example, at the beginning of every day, our students sing the national anthem. A few of the more monarchist teachers also lead them in God Save the King. They have sort of class pledges where they sort of commit themselves to the pursuit of intellectual and moral virtues and discipline. And it creates this culture that is really focused on leisure, on friendship, and on seeking wisdom in community.
Mhm.
It's really beautiful to see that coming together.
Wonderful. So that mix of traditions and rituals is one of the things that ground your school. So I want to ask you a little bit about, first of all, what do you mean by a classical school? And if you could just clarify for people that are not familiar with charter schools, I think they're unique to Alberta. Can you help us understand what those two things are?
Sure, I'll speak first to what a classical school is.
Mhm.
So classical education is what for many centuries was just termed education. And we're trying to revive a lot of the kind of philosophical underpinnings of education over the last several hundred, or actually a couple thousand years. So we go back to the classics. Our students study ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy. They study classic literature. They memorize poems. They study Latin. We have ancient Greek clubs, Mandarin clubs. And we try to expose them to what Matthew Arnold called the best that has been said and written, right? So perennial ideas that have stood the test of time and demonstrated their values over time. I think there's also classical education starts with a different kind of anthropology. So that is a different view of man than what you'd find in sort of progressive or modern education, and a
Mhm.
different set of metaphysical assumptions that underpin it. And if I were to try to describe very succinctly what that difference is, we believe that truth exists. So it's not, there's no such thing as my truth and your truth. Truth actually exists. It's a real thing that is out there. It is synonymous with the good. So truth is good. We think we should be seeking it. We should use it as sort of a measure of what we're doing. And it's synonymous with justice and beauty too. All of what
Mhm.
Plato would describe as the forms of the good. And so basically, we think that reality is coherent, it's intelligible, we can apprehend it, at least to some degree, through the application of reason. And we then try to attune our souls to it. So we're trying to live in accord with reality and in harmony with it. Whereas a lot of what progressive education is trying to do is achieve some knowledge of reality so as to transform it and to change it. So a lot of progressive education reformers see education as a sort of vehicle for social transformation. And if that's not the case, then they might also take a kind of utilitarian view that education is just about getting a good job or something. So we reject those approaches. We say, no, a liberal education is an education for its own sake. What we study because they are emancipatory of the human soul and spirit. And we believe that we should just be sort of seeking things that are beautiful, that are true, that are eternally good.
Wow. So you've actually confronted us with a lot of major differences in worldviews in education. A school isn't a school isn't a school. So you have to really look at what your child is getting here in terms of a worldview. So we want to kind of get at that a little bit. And I just want to tell again the audience to understand that I'm having this conversation with Caylan Ford, a leader in education, founder of classical schools in Alberta. And we're talking about education as we go back to school. So we welcome your comments and your questions, and a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us. So, it's fascinating. Caylan, you said earlier that you actually believe in truth. And I think for a lot of parents or observers, grandparents, whoever you are, aunts and uncles, we'd all kind of scratch our head and say, what the heck? You're talking about truth. I thought that's what they talk about in school. So then you're alluding to this so-called progressive movement of education. Gosh, there's a lot of things here that help us understand what's going on here when you seem to be implying that some schools don't assume that there is truth here.
Yeah, I think no, that's certainly the case. I think if you speak with a lot of educators today, not all of them, but a lot of educators, if you talk about the idea of kind of big T truth, they would get very uncomfortable. They would say that truth is sort of, it's subjective, it's kind of
Mm.
fungible in a way. You have a truth, I have a truth. Um, and this is a very pervasive way of thinking. It becomes even more obvious in the realm of sort of values. So nothing will make a room of kind of modern educators more uncomfortable than if you start talking about virtue. They'll say that that sort of smacks of religiosity or something, and so is suspect. And who are you to impose your values on me or whatever? The problem is if you can't, as a society, agree that there's a truth and that it is a thing to which you can appeal in the case of disagreement, in the case of moral contestation, then you lose. There's sort of the center won't hold. There's not no way of adjudicating disputes anymore. There's no way of saying that this is actually better than this or this is more true than this. And so your capacity to engage in that kind of dialogue breaks down, and all you have left is power. So that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want to get into a state of it's sort of war of all against all. It's a war of wills, and it's a matter of who can wrest the most power to sort of subjugate others to their will. We actually think there are eternal standards against which human beings and human actions can be judged, and we can and we should try to apprehend those to the best of our ability and then apply them to ourselves.
Okay, so that's quite significant. I mean, there's a kind of a confusing depth of philosophical conversation here, but you need to be aware as a parent that there are very real debates, wars going on in education as it's kind of reflective of larger society around kind of a more socialist Marxist view of the world versus a more traditional view of the world. Is that another way to kind of summarize this debate that's going on in education?
Well, it's funny you bring up a Marxist worldview. I realize this often sounds like hyperbole or it sounds overdone.
Yeah.
People are always kind of trying to ascribe social ills to Marxism, but it's pretty justified in the realm of education. So a lot of the very influential education reformers of the kind of mid-late 20th century were unabashed Marxists.
Mhm.
And they were tremendously influential and continue to be tremendously influential. So one example that I often rail against is a Portuguese or Brazilian reformer called Paulo Freire. He was the author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is one of the most frequently cited works of social science in history. It's like the third most cited work, or I think right after like The Origin of Species or something. And yet no one outside of education faculties has ever heard of it. So that tells you the scale of its influence within those circles. Everyone, almost everyone who goes through a Bachelor of Education degree, knowingly or unknowingly, has imbibed his ideas. And as I said, unabashed Marxist, you read the footnotes of his book and it's just full of sort of approving references to
Yes.
Mao and Lenin and Che Guevara and others and
Mhm.
Marxist theorists. And it's very Marxist in the sense, not necessarily that it is advocating class struggle, for example,
Mhm.
but in the sense of its kind of unbounded Promethean will, that there is a rejection of the idea that reality is given to us.
Mhm.
So the classical view is that we are part of creation, we're created,
Mhm.
and reality is a given, right? So truth, beauty, justice, insofar as you believe these things are real, they're given to us. And now human beings are maybe, we have a special role in creation. We're possessed of creative capacities ourselves that other animals are
Mhm.
not. We're kind of like delegate or sub-creators, you could argue. But the Marxist view, and this is carried over into Freire and others, is that reality is not given. Reality is entirely a product of human consciousness. So
Mhm.
we are not sub-creators, we are the creators, and nothing is above us. And so we can just remake reality at will, is
Well, it
basically.
sounds like we've become gods.
So it's precisely that. There's this kind of strange, like diabolical instinct in Freire that you start
Mhm.
to notice, and you can't unsee it once you see it.
Yeah.
It is very much, he even sort of adopts kind of biblical language about the logos. He talks about how human beings need to sort of speak the word. and then re-speak it such that it never actually becomes moored to anything real. So we need to continually be recreating reality, not toward any particular end. There's no telos. Simply as a way of asserting our agency, we need to be constantly remaking reality and redefining it. And so that's why I said that this worldview, it is fundamentally, it's hostile to the idea that reality is given, that we are subordinate to laws higher than ourselves. It's a kind of, it's a will to power is what drives it. And it's this idea that we can just sort of transform nature at will. And of course we can't.
Yeah. And so anyways, I don't know whether to cry or to laugh here because it's so absurd here. And I'm unfortunately, like you, have had to read these authors, and they all kind of come out of the bowels of the universities, particularly the faculties of education. And you can't make this stuff up. It is really quite absurd. And so I don't mean to be unfair to anybody, but this is, really problematic thinking. It certainly comes not out of our traditional thinking as Western civilization. It comes out of somewhere else, which is another story. But the point is, it matters. Why does it matter to parents? Like why? Like this is kind of an overarching, warning to people that don't be naive when you go into schools and you see all these strange things happening, because it comes out of that philosophical background. Like there's a reason why. Like I was talking with a friend of mine today about he was going back to school the day before yesterday, and the whole classroom, pardon me, not the classroom, the whole hallway, the main hallway of the school was plastered with pride flags and representations of, quote, heroes of pride. It wasn't about the Canadian unified identity. It was all about that kind of lens, and nothing against anybody in terms of their background, who may have different perspectives. But I mean, it's just over the top. So why should parents care about understanding this kind of background then, Caylan? Why does it matter?
So I think what I was just talking about relates to this. So one of the ideas that you'd find in Freire and other Marxist thinkers is he would say that in any situation that you find yourself in, you should be attempting basically to do this assessment of who is oppressing whom, or what is oppressing me in this situation. And once you've identified any kind of limit on your will or appetite or whatever, you need to destroy that limit. So it's a worldview that, well, one, it reduces everything to this unidimensional frame of who is oppressing whom. The oppressor is presumed to be bad. The oppressed has all of the sort of moral valor. And then you need to destroy that situation. And so I think you see this attitude coming through in, it has various transhumanist manifestations. Right? So people who are kind of in revolt or in flight against biological limits, who believe that we can just sort of remake them through, scientific technique or through control of language or something. That's an expression, I think, of this desire to destroy the limits that nature imposes upon us. And similarly, this kind of the sacralizing of presumed victims in every context also arises out of that way of thinking. So I guess what I would suggest to parents is, this year, all of our faculty every year do a book study together. And the last 2 years, they did Aristotle's Ethics and then Plato's Republic. This year, they're doing something different in Calgary. They're reading Neil Postman's End of Education. So,
oh yes,
more contemporary, but it's quite solid. And I think one of the insights that he posits there is that we have lost a kind of unifying narrative in education. Basically, the place of God has been lost. We've lost the sense that as human beings, there are not just worldly, but ultimate ends towards which we are oriented. And when you lose that, everything else sort of it just loses its coherence. What's the point of anything if you can't answer the question of what follows this life, for example? But we haven't entirely lost God. It's just we've replaced the old gods with the new. And the new gods are things like, for example, a kind of scientific rationalism or social justice. I think the problem is that these are very weak gods, and they can't they sort of can't satisfy people as spiritual meaning-seeking beings. So I think where that where that will lead young people is to places of sort of listless despair and a sense that they don't have a direction. So when you look at surveys of young people, the number of children who say that their lives don't have meaning has just skyrocketed. The rates of sort of anxiety and depressive disorders and suicidal ideation have all skyrocketed. Now we can link that to things like smartphones and social media, but I think part of it is also that we're worshiping very weak, very feeble gods, basically, in schools. And every school has their own, there's no such thing as sort of value neutral education. Every school has a set of values and normative assumptions that they are passing on to children. And as parents, I think we need to know what those are. And I think a lot of parents don't. They haven't thought about it in these terms. So I'd say understand what gods your student is being taught to worship and consider whether those are actually going to be fulfilling for them in the long term in their lives.
No, I think you're spot on, Caylan, and that's the punchline. You need to be aware of what is the level of thinking here, and what to use your phrase, what are the gods that your children are being taught to appreciate and love? And that needs to be a very conscious decision. So speaking of back to school then, is there a back to school book that you'd recommend on this topic to help parents discern what's up or down here?
Oh my goodness. I recently picked up a really wonderful anthology called The Great Tradition, and it's a selection of classical readings on education. So I was just perusing it yesterday and reading Plutarch on how to attend to your lectures. And there's several readings on how to raise children. I think that's where I would point people to is read Plutarch, Seneca, read Aristotle and Boethius, and talk about them with your kids. And I think that you'll find that it's sort of soul-filling in a way that the modern culture is not able to do.
All right, so that's some great advice from Caylan Ford. I'm talking with her as the founder of a number of classical education schools in Alberta. What are your ideas here? Speaking of parents and back to school, it's interesting in the comments I have a person identified as Pearman Brothers who says they're actually a parent at one of your schools. And that's exciting. And their comment is the school that they go to, it is one of the greatest, pardon me, I'm just trying to look at the comment here. They really appreciate the school. And it has been a great relief to be able to go to the school, and they just, obviously really recommend it. So, we'd love to hear more about these comments from different parents, but just what a remarkable comment that one of your parents is on with us today. So that's terrific.
Well,
one of the other resources I'd recommend. Yes. Sorry, what's that, Caylan?
I promise that was not a setup, but I had no hand in that one.
You didn't have any hand in that. Well, it's amazing the reach of the program. So that's terrific. I did want to recommend some other resources to parents, and one of which is the Frontier Center for Public Policy, the website. There's some wonderful pieces done by a number of educators, including senior fellow Michael Zagstra, who talks about a number of these topics around education and education performance. And in fact, there was an interview that we rebroadcast just a few weeks ago. And look also for the interview I did do with Caylan Ford about a year ago. And that's on the Leaders on the Frontier Return to Reason website. And make sure you listen to that. It's really a timeless one. I did have the opportunity to listen to it, and it's really withstood the test of time. So I think it was a wonderful discussion. So let's continue to dive into the topic of what are classical schools a little bit. So you teach a variety of subject areas like other schools, Caylan, including great books. Is that right?
Yeah. So charter schools, I didn't answer your earlier question about.
Oh, yes. Charter schools.
So I'll loop back to that and then connect it. So charter schools are public schools. They are unique to Alberta, but there are a number of other international jurisdictions that have charter schools or versions thereof. So we're public, tuition-free, non-sectarian. We're not allowed to have a religious affiliation. We're beholden to all of the same statutory and regulatory requirements as other public schools in the province. So the same, we're audited annually. We have to publicly post our financial statements, our annual education plans, all of that. The only difference really is that charter schools are not governed by the large metro school boards. So we have our own board of directors. Most charter schools have directors that are elected from among their parent community, for example. And we have distinct philosophical or pedagogical approaches that are not being offered in the elsewhere in the public system. So in our case, we're offering a classical liberal arts education. So all that to say, we are beholden to the provincial curriculum and programs of study, but we deliver them in a different way and we enhance it in various ways. So for example, in what is termed social studies, we like to call it history and geography, our students study world history 4 times from sort of start to finish. So they study it sequentially. They start in kindergarten, grade 1 with the ancient world. In grade 2, they study ancient Rome and look at sort of early medieval Europe. And like the Tang and Song dynasties in China. Grade 3, they're moving into sort of the high medieval era and early Renaissance and age of exploration. Grade 4, they're into the modern era. And then they go back in grade 5 to the ancient world. Along with that, they also study Canadian history and civics. And then we have a great books program. So we have reading lists that are, they're public on our website, actually. So if anyone wants to see them, you can. We have poetry lists. Our students memorize a lot of poetry, so they do a lot of memory work.
What? You ask them to memorize something, Caylan? That's absurd.
Well,
why do you do that?
Yeah. So my daughter in grade 3 last year, her class memorized 15 classic poems. Some Shakespeare, a lot of like Robert Louis Stevenson. So it's a little more accessible at that grade level, but they love it and they're very, very good at it. So this is an age where I think a metaphor that's often used in sort of classic literature on education is the idea of sort of like a wax seal, right? This is the age at which the wax is soft and you can you easily impress things in it. They're also just at an age where they're capable of absorbing and retaining massive amounts of information. So the kind of neoclassical education movement, as it's developed over the last hundreds plus years, has taken this idea of the classical trivium, which is grammar, logic or dialectic, and rhetoric, and has kind of overlaid that with different stages of cognitive development. So we say, our grammar stage is kindergarten to grade 4. In that era, in that stage, students are, in addition to memorizing all of the rules of English grammar, they're exposed to some basic Latin grammar. But we try to expose them to a just really broad range of knowledge about natural sciences, history, geography. They memorize mathematical math facts and algorithms in that age. And then they move into what we call like the logic or dialectic phase, where they're naturally getting to be a little more argumentative. And we teach them how to make arguments well. So we teach them how to evaluate primary sources, how to take different perspectives in the course of doing that and studying history, to identify logical fallacies and basically to figure out what makes a good or a bad argument. And then
that is very impressive. So you're teaching kids to identify logical fallacies. That is music to my ears. That would really help our society cut through a lot of nonsense, to say it politely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
so we've got a number of questions here. Caylan, I noticed that, first of all, M. Clausen says, what a great conversation. Definitely. Thank you for that comment. There's also a question from Frank Hallward who says, is there a focus on team building and sport?
Oh, yeah. Classical education it wouldn't be complete if it was sort of purely cognitive or intellectual, right? So in addition to trying to cultivate sort of a beautiful intellect and soul, you should also care about your body. And, as we think that reality is good, we think the fact of human embodiment is also a good. And so we should develop it. So look, one of our campuses doesn't have a gym. One of them, the gym is a big warehouse, but we make do. So we do have team sports. We try to pursue an actually systematic progression in athletics. So it's not just play, right? There's an important place for play, but there's an important place also for actually developing skills systematically and being evaluated on your mastery of those skills. We value team sports very highly because it's one of these areas where you really actually acquire the virtues that we talk about. So,
All right.
virtues of magnanimity, of being able to sort of do well in victory and defeat,
Hmm.
of grit, of fortitude, perseverance. These are all virtues that are really well developed in the context of sports and athletics. So that's a very important part of our program as well.
Wow. Sounds like a great place. I think we should all sign up and maybe join the school tomorrow. So speaking of the school, we do have a clip that we want to share because, a picture's worth 1,000 words, as they say, and I think this will help explain more about these schools.
From the moment you walk through the doors at the Classical Academy, you can tell this is not an ordinary school. On the walls, you'll find beautiful works of art, pieces that have been admired for centuries, if not millennia. Inside the classrooms, expert teachers guide students through a knowledge-rich curriculum using proven teaching methods of explicit instruction and the Socratic method. Beginning in grade 5, our students study Latin and all wear uniforms. But don't let that throw you. We're not a private school. As a public charter school, the Classical Academy is tuition-free and open to all learners who seek moral and intellectual excellence, without regard to their background, financial means, or postal code. We focus on the cultivation of virtues like courage, integrity, benevolence, fortitude, temperance, and magnanimity, or the quality of being great-souled. We use an enhanced classical curriculum, at the heart of which is a great books program. Our students read whole texts, books with depth and enduring value that illuminate those unchanging aspects of the human condition. They're exposed to the best that has been thought and said in East or West, and are ennobled through the study of classical fine and performing arts, like poetry, drama, music, dance, painting, and sculpting. Through our outdoor education program, students gain the opportunity to directly study and observe the natural world, and to contemplate the majesty and wonder of creation. Notably absent from our classrooms are the ubiquitous screens and the distraction of smartphones. Because we value deep learning and concentration, we use screen-based technologies in a minimal, deliberate way, and smartphones are prohibited. At the Classical Academy, our goal is not just to help students achieve academically, it is to prepare their minds and souls for liberty. We understand that our students are not just future workers, they're future friends, neighbors, spouses, parents, and citizens. They are bearers of divine souls which thirst after knowledge of what is true, good, and enduring. Our mission is to help them grow in virtue and in wisdom so that they may live well and with purpose.
So there you have it. It's a lovely overview. I think I recognized your voice, Caylan, overviewing the classical schools. And there's so many things that one could pick up from that overview. And of course, I'm talking with Caylan Ford, the founder of those schools. So we welcome your questions from the audience. We really do appreciate that. A number of things that struck me, one of which was the emphasis on teaching virtue and skills, but purpose in life. And I think that's very powerful. And I noticed the wonderful pictures of the kids, and they were in uniforms. Why uniforms, Caylan?
Well, I think there's a couple major reasons to have uniforms. One is it creates a sense that this is a distinctive community, and our students have a very strong sense of community within the schools. So they understand that they're in a place that is sort of set apart from the outside world in many different ways. It's something that gives them pride. So they have to learn how to take care of their uniforms and wear them properly. So they learn a sense of propriety through that. And it levels socioeconomic differences, right? So students are not kind of worried about what they're going to wear to school. They're not worried about showing off or sort of competing with peers, which is especially an issue for girls. They actually get to sort of focus on their studies and on what they ought to be focusing on. A lot of our families, we have families from very diverse backgrounds, religiously, linguistically, ethnically, and socioeconomically. And so it just creates a level playing field for all of those students and emphasizes what they have in common. It also, I think, you hear kids sometimes saying that clothes are a way of expressing their individuality. I'm very skeptical of this idea. I think fashion trends tend to be highly mimetic. Mostly we're just imitating what other people are doing or what sort of popular models are doing, models of imitation, I mean. you're not actually developing an authentic personality. So when you kind of take that off the table, if people want to differentiate themselves, they have to focus on those inward aspects of their character, their habits, their interests, and cultivate those. And those are, we think, a much more authentic expression of the human personality than what you're wearing.
Okay, so let's again focus on the character of people, their virtue, their souls, if you will. In fact, it's interesting that you use that word souls, and the divine. There's almost like a spiritual framework that you're looking at education as well, which is, I don't think you'd hear in most schools, would you?
No, probably not. And we go back to Aristotle and to Plato and reflecting on these things, right? Aristotle too talks about how there is a divine component of our souls and how we should endeavor to sort of put on immortality as far as is possible, because these are the ultimate ends of human life. And we're not sort of we're not in this kind of empiricist, materialistic frame where we think that the only reality that is relevant to us is the reality of sort of getting a job or making money. We actually think that there's sort of an eternal destiny that we have as human beings, and we're concerned with how we prepare ourselves for that.
Okay, so that's a lovely insight there. So I do have a number of comments. Actually, there's an interesting quote here from a listener, from a gentleman named Mr. Clausen. It is necessary to care for the body, not for its own sake, but because it is the abode of the soul. There we go, back to the soul as we think of Musonius Rufus, of all things. And then the parent who attends one of your schools under the name the Pearman Brothers says, I was at a cross-country meet yesterday with my daughters. Boy, it sounds like we're getting the inside scoop, Caylan, on your schools here. The school performed well, a few second-place finishes. Not my kids, sadly. There is a sports league for all of the charter schools in the city. We also have basketball, volleyball, badminton, and soccer. They also have special programs a few times a year, like fencing and martial arts, which don't compete in the same program, but are great ways to introduce them to other disciplines. I think Socrates was a wrestler, as were other philosophers. I think that's what it says. I didn't know that about Socrates. So that's a lovely comment. Is that true, Caylan, in your perspective?
We also have at least one teacher trained in Greco-Roman wrestling. So yes, it's very, very true.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I should look that one up. So when we look at Socrates, one of the things, of course, that he's well known for is the Socratic method. Do you teach the Socratic method in those schools that you speak so highly of Socrates?
Yes. So in classical education, there are sort of understood to be two major ways that students learn. One is the mimetic, and I've referenced that term before. It basically means by imitation. And another is the Socratic. So both are very important, and there's a place for both in our schools. So the mimetic is, for example, it would be methods of explicit instruction where a teacher is trying to teach a new skill. Let's say it's a math skill. They'll do it first, and then they will all do it together, and then the students will do it on their own. So it's a kind of I do, we do, you do approach. That's an example of mimetic instruction where the students are imitating what the teacher has done and learning how to do it on their own. And then the teacher is sort of checking for understanding. This is a very, very effective form of instruction. So today it goes under the name explicit or direct instruction. And in study after study, this is shown to be the best way that young students learn, and it particularly advantages students who are sort of more disadvantaged in their home environments. And then another approach is Socratic, which is sort of, it's a raising of questions and engaging students in dialectic dialogue. So that will involve Socratic seminars most often, but we can do it in different ways throughout the class, where maybe you pose a question, a student gives a partial answer, you try to sort of introduce another perspective into that conversation. And it takes us some training to know how to do Socratic seminars well and to have it be fruitful, because what you don't want is to train students in constantly just sort of deconstructing reality. one, because it makes them sort of insufferable, but also because it leads them into a kind of void, a nihilistic void. So
Now,
uh,
what do you mean by insufferable? You mean anxious?
no, I mean the kind of obnoxious, precocious teenager,
Okay.
like some of us might have been, that is always sort of, poking holes in arguments.
Mhm.
And it never leads them to truth because they're always just sort of deconstructing everything. So,
Mhm.
so there's a skill in leading Socratic discussions well, and directing them so that students are actually getting closer to truth, not just sort of
Critiquing.
yeah, exactly. It's not pure criticism.
Mhm.
You're actually engaging in dialectic so that you can apprehend what is true. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So, if we could a little bit in our conversation, because we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's been very interesting the questions and comments from the audience. So keep them coming. Is the whole question of the role of parents? Can you give us advice there as we go back to school? What's perhaps a good, or how do you see the role of the parent in going
Well,
back to school?
yeah. So in our school, we very much, and this is typical of a lot of charter schools, I think, especially, we embrace the view that parents are the primary educator of their children, that the home is where the most foundational and important education comes from. And so we very much try to treat parents as partners. Now, we have an advantage in that we're a school of choice, right? So naturally, we're drawing parents who are drawn to our philosophy, who hopefully agree with it, at least in large part. Um, and so that probably makes our task a little easier. I think what you find in some schools is teachers who, again, I don't want to generalize overly broadly, but there are a lot of teachers, I think, who view parents with different values somewhat contemptuously, and who think that they know better than the students' parents. And insofar as that family may have more traditional values in certain respects, there are teachers out there who see it as their role to disrupt their family's values and the transmission of those values. So,
No kidding. So that's part of, again, this reflection of the kind of the debate, to put it politely, of these different worldviews of education, is that there be teachers that come out of these faculties of education that you use the word contemptuous. I mean, that's a pretty tough word. We're actually getting some comments of agreement from our audience, like Prairie here. It says 100% agree. So what's going on there? The teachers, is it as simple as saying that there are people who basically see your kids as their property and you're not the parent? Like, this is bizarre. Like, who thinks they're qualified to be your child's parent, like, other than the parents themselves? It's just utterly bizarre. But some people think like that. Is that what you're getting at?
oh, I think so. I struggle to inhabit that perspective, so I don't think I can fully
Yes.
explain it. But I think it's an idea that that we should break from the past, and that sort of, I think it's an attempt to intentionally sever the chain of connection between the generations, and to sort of interrupt the transmission of values that we have inherited, so that you can then build a new world, right? So if you have
Oh.
this sort of, if you've imbibed this kind of utopian framework that you want to remake the world and you want to remake it better, that requires breaking from the past, right? And again, going back to our theme of totalitarianism, I mean, there's a reason so many totalitarian systems would come into power and try to erase and destroy history, or literally restart the calendar at year zero, right? It's because that sort of, that inherited baggage, as they would see it, limits your ability to build a new world. And we're just the opposite. We actually think that we very explicitly want to preserve this idea that civilization is an intergenerational compact, that we owe debts to those who came before us and to those who will follow us in posterity, and that we should try to preserve what has been passed to us, hopefully improve upon it if we can, and then pass it along intact to the next generation. So again, I think it's just a very fundamentally different worldview at play there.
Okay, but it is, I think you're onto something, Caylan, in the sense that if you believe, as a quote progressive thinker, and you're hip out of the faculties of education, you think that building utopia requires, to paraphrase somebody, if it requires breaking a few eggshells to build the utopia, then your children are the important pathway. Totalitarians have always seen children and education as a necessary means to be able to build the new society. As you said, that the wax is not hardened yet, it's soft and malleable. If we can just get a hold of those kids, we can build that better future through their minds.
Yeah, that's
it,
precisely
isn't it?
Yeah.
It's frightening. It just sounds so Maoist. And, we look at the disasters of how many people were killed and murdered through communism and socialism. I mean, these are very important context and warnings. So, again, we, as the comment said here from Prairie, we want education, not indoctrination. So I think we're onto something here. So as we think about the role of parents, that obviously you've articulated as being primary in terms of education. What about the roles of teachers then? Like, do you have advice in terms of how to relate to your teacher?
How to relate to your teacher as a parent, you mean, or
as a parent? Yes, pardon me. I should have qualified that.
Yeah, well, I would hope that parents find ways to be involved with the classroom. So I know not everyone has the ability or the bandwidth to volunteer, but if you can, that's a really great thing to do. And making sure that you have open communication pathways. I sort of, I'm kind of loath to suggest that you should be on your teacher's back all the time, because obviously that takes a lot away from the teacher. If they have 20 to 30 parents who are sort of constantly requiring communication, that's difficult. But I think finding ways to be involved, to know your teacher, to ask questions of your children, to communicate proactively if you think that your children are falling behind. This is kind of more practical and less philosophical, but in opening schools, we see a lot of kids applying and coming in, and their parents think that they're doing fine academically, and their report cards suggest that they're, above average students, and they're in fact several grade levels behind. So a lot of parents have no idea how bad it is in terms of their child's acquisition of foundational numeracy and literacy skills, for example.
Wait a sec. Can you clarify that? So you're saying that there's parents who are kind of passive. They think their kids are doing well. Their report cards seem to be suggesting they're doing okay, but they could be several grades behind? Seriously? Yeah. That happens today?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you see just rampant grade inflation in schools across the country. Because I think teachers and administrators don't want to deal with upset parents whose children are failing. I think there's increasingly sort of trendy ideas that failing children or giving them poor grades will destroy their self-confidence, and that's sort of the worst thing you could do to them. So, 50 is sort of the minimum grade you'll ever get. And so, yeah, you have a lot of parents whose kids have been passed along. Their report cards don't indicate an obvious problem. Teachers are also overburdened, right? In Alberta, for example, our population's grown substantially in the last several years, and you have a lot of teachers now with classrooms of over 30 children. That's a lot to deal with. So there are sort of systemic pressures. There are also, I think, kind of ideological or philosophical reasons why a lot of teachers don't feel supported by school administrators or school boards in giving failing grades. And so they're not incentivized to be honest with parents about where they are.
Okay, so what an absurd system. So the report card doesn't really mean anything if Johnny and Sally are all getting A's and B's.
Well, A's and B's would be great. I think in British Columbia, they've moved to a model where the report cards use sort of vague language like emerging, developing, reaching. No one knows what this means, right? And I think it's intended to sort of soften the blow maybe for children who are not doing well. I'm not really sure. But again, it's you're sort of confounding the signals that would normally tell parents that there's something wrong with the education their child is receiving.
Okay. But on the other hand, maybe if we look at the education system from a large kind of macro policy point of view, it's kind of a racket. If you have a kind of a public monopoly in education and there's not a variety of choices, it's very easy for the inside actors to say, you know what, it's too much work to give out grades. It's too much work to fail a student out of a caring sense of truth and helping that child really learn. They want to talk about quote diversity, equity, inclusion all the time because they don't want to talk about the ABCs and performance and actually helping kids learn so they can actually be prepared for life and the world. Is that another way to see it? Am I being too cynical, Caylan?
No, I think your cynicism is merited. And again, I don't want to give the impression that all teachers are like this. There are a lot of really, really excellent, very dedicated teachers who are doing their best. And also a lot of them are in very demoralizing environments and are doing their best in spite of it. But I think it is much easier to teach doxa, basically, to teach opinion, or to have students engage in sort of student-led projects than it is to do explicit instruction. So the explicit instruction I was describing earlier is discouraged in university faculties of education. So future teachers are told not to use the most effective method to teach children. They're told that it's sort of oppressive, because if you're actually teaching something as a teacher, you're presuming ignorance on the part of your students, and so you're.
That's right. It's oppressive.
It's oppressive to So again, this goes back to Paulo Freire. The idea that the teacher should teach and the students learn, the teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. This to him is an example of an oppressive dynamic, and you need to level these hierarchies. So you shouldn't have teachers and students. You should have student teachers and teacher students. If you ever hear teachers saying things like, I learn as much from my students as they do from me, these are people who have been, again, probably unwittingly influenced by this idea. So a common phrase that people use is, you should be a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage as a teacher. So you should be basically just sort of at the side of your students, facilitating student-led exploration, not actually leading the teaching. So,
gosh.
So it's that.
What? Yeah. This is unbelievable. It sounds like a lot of tripe to me. And, anyways, I've been looking at this stuff like you have for years. But so what are your comments? I hear from Frank Hallward. Here is the issue with first place ribbons for all. I think I get your drift, Frank. First ribbons for all. So what does it really mean to learn here? I want to get back to a few quick questions as well. Do you allow smartphones? I believe Australia is weighing in this week, saying that they're going to forbid smartphones. I know some provinces are doing this now. I think in Manitoba, I believe they're prohibiting smartphones. Does anyone know? I think that's the case. Is that a good thing? Do you allow how many smartphones do you allow in your school, Caylan?
By the way, I'd love to come back to the ribbon point in a moment.
Oh, okay,
yes,
sure.
Ontario and Alberta, and I think maybe some other provinces, have recently imposed requirements that schools ban smartphones, at least in the classroom. We don't think that goes far enough, because the students can still have them in their backpacks. They can still have them at lunchtime in the hallways. So our school is totally smartphone free. If a staff member sees or hears one, they will confiscate it for a substantial and painful amount of time.
Oh my.
So on first offense, it's to the end of that week. Second offense is 2 weeks. Third offense is 4 weeks. If there is a fourth offense, we contemplate the use of a trebuchet to eject the smartphone from the premises. We've not.
Sorry, a what? What did you say?
Oh, it's a medieval siege weapon.
Okay, I was going to say. That's what I thought. Okay, well, there you have it. Wow.
And the reason, there's several reasons we do that, right? One is there's a huge amount of data now that having smartphones, even in your bag, is a distraction that limits the amount that you will learn. So test scores go down by a measurable amount when students have smartphones within reach, as opposed to when they don't. They also militate against the kind of deep learning and concentration that we're trying to foster. Right? We want
but let's be real, because I don't mean to chuckle, because it seems kind of humorous and make fun of it, but there's been a lot of research done on the negative impacts on brain development by cell phones and social media on young people. I mean, this is so well proven now. And not only that, you have all kinds of data and research actually from the designers of these devices. They're designed to be addictive. I mean, for obvious reasons. And I do recall, and I've cited this many times, is the famous quote by one of the tech gurus said, when asked, do you allow your children to have smartphones? He said, no, this would destroy their ability to think. And that was from, I'm paraphrasing, from the late Steve Jobs. So let's wake up, people. So if you're a parent, get the smartphone out of their hands. Is that right, Caylan?
Oh, absolutely. So as you alluded to, I think Jonathan Haidt has done a great job publicizing a lot of these findings about the correlation between smartphone adoption and social media and various forms of mental health problems, so anxiety, depression, etc. But as you mentioned, there's the sort of academic or the intellectual dimension. It's addictive. It destroys your ability to concentrate. It destroys even adults' ability to concentrate. I think we've probably all noticed that. And children's minds are so much more malleable. So you can imagine the impact there. But also, we talk in our school about educating for freedom, right? We say that we want to impart the habits, the knowledge, and the virtues necessary to be a free citizen. And I don't think a student is free when they're addicted to a device. I don't think any of us are free when we have addictions that we don't will for ourselves. And so we want our students to be free. And that means that they have to be able to sort of rely on their own faculties and to cultivate them and to have this capacity for inner stillness and tranquility. We want them to be able to sort of, when the going gets tough in life, to retire into their own souls and to be rejuvenated and to find rest there. And how do you do that if your whole reality is sort of oriented around these sort of simulacra that you get on the screen? And the effects on our kids are extraordinary. So numerous teachers have told us that in coming to our school, it's night and day, because even at the elementary level, in their public schools, at recess, at lunchtime, kids aren't playing together. They're congregating around phones, and they're staring.
No kidding.
And at our school, they're actually playing. And so it's this kind of miraculous recovery of innocence that they get to experience. They actually just get to socialize as human beings face to face again.
Wow, what a powerful insight. Let's get the kids playing again with each other so they can be kids and learn and grow in that socialization. Isn't that a marvelous vision? Wow.
And I saw a study recently that researchers had asked a group of young people, how much money would you have to be paid to agree to give up your phone? And it was something like averaged a couple $100 the kids would give up their phone for. But then they flipped the question and said, well, what about if all of your friends and peers also had their devices and social media taken away? And the kids would pay money to have that happen. So
no kidding.
They don't want to miss out. They don't want to be the only one who doesn't have this, because your group chat is like, it's where jokes are exchanged and weekend plans are made and all the rest. You don't want to miss out. But these kids, by their own admission, they have the self-awareness to know that this is bad for them. And if they could go to a place where their social ecosystem doesn't have this at all, they would. So we're trying to do, by having a school that is smartphone free. We also have a no pop culture rule. So our kids aren't allowed to reference pop culture in the school.
No kidding.
We're trying to create
no TikTok? No
TikTok, no. Sometimes they're like, well, what if we're singing classic songs like the Backstreet Boys? And then my heart just hurts. So we have a no smartphone, no pop culture rule. And that allows them to have an ecosystem where they get to be human in a way that would have been recognizable to our ancestors.
Wow. But I love this conversation. It's very insightful. And I've got some comments. Prairie says, this technology has exposed many, many bad players in the education system. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, isn't it, Caylan?
Some bad players. Well, what's fascinating to me is when provinces have moved to ban smartphones in class, which you'd think would be something that everyone would support, it's sort of shocking that there are people who say, no, actually, they need this. And as teachers, we need this. So I struggle to understand this. I think part of the idea is that, if you want to compete in the 21st century, you need to have these skills. I think this is a very poorly reasoned argument. Doom scrolling is not a skill. And uploading videos on TikTok is not a skill. These people are being used by technology. They're not using it. And they're
Right
not
on.
certainly not understanding how it works. But also, this whole idea of like relevance, like 21st century jobs and relevance, look, no one can predict what kind of jobs are going to be relevant in the 21st century. What we can predict is that we need to be human. And there's sort of unchanging aspects of the human condition that we need to be attentive to, and we need to make ourselves capable of leading good lives, no matter what kind of economy or job landscape we inherit. And so that's what we're trying to focus on. We're not trying to be sort of relevant or trendy. We're trying to be timeless quite deliberately.
Right on. So I do have two questions that are related to this topic, and one has to do with parents, and the other one has to do with freedom. The first question I have, Caylan, on this point is that if you are a parent and you're listening into this conversation, you say, well, that's easy for Caylan Ford to talk about classical education, but my child is in a public school that is got some real issues to it. I go into it and it's kind of chaotic, and people don't wear uniforms, and there's some good things about it, but man, there's some really serious things. I don't even relate to the teacher very well. They don't even want to promise to tell me if they're counseling my child to question their gender identity. Those are sometimes very real situations that parents are confronted with today. What's your advice? Should the parent basically make the hard decision to try to make the best of it, or in fact, take their child out of that school?
Well, obviously, I can't make a blanket recommendation for every parent, right? Not everyone is in a position where they could homeschool or start their own school. And, I think where those options exist, they're wonderful options, right? There are excellent homeschooling programs out there. There's a lot of great classical homeschooling programs. There are even in both Calgary and Edmonton, and I think in other places, there are kind of homeschooling co-op programs that are 1 or 2 days a week, and then homeschooling for the rest that are very, very good programs. So I think where those are options, that's great. But where that's not an option, I would suggest two things. One, you can write to your MPP or your MLAs and say, we want more choice in education, and we want to be able to access different kinds of programs. So advocate for charter schools, or for more equitable funding for independent schools, for example. That could be something that you could do. And I think there's also various ways that you can supplement your child's education. So even if they're in a public school that you feel a little iffy or uncertain about, I think being very active and involved, having dinner table conversations, reading books together as a family and having conversations about them. I think there are ways that you can try as a parent to kind of inoculate your children against potentially pernicious effects in the home.
Okay, so I think that's very helpful advice. I mean, it's a tough situation. It's not easy for parents to make these decisions, but ultimately, it sounds like parents need to be active. You can't be passive when it comes to being that primary partner for your child's education. So do not be sold the bill of goods that somehow, no, it's the school that's the primary actor in your education. No, you as the parent are the primary actor. Is that's foundational principle, isn't it, Caylan?
Good summary, yeah.
Okay, so there's another second question I do want to get to, and it has to do with the theme of freedom, because I'm getting some comments around, I think it relates to this whole business about cell phones. And it's a very interesting point, and that is, are you really an advocate for freedom if you restrict people from having their cell phones? I mean, are you just trying to educate kids, or what? Come on, did we catch you in the act here, Caylan? You're contradicting yourself.
So to answer this question, we have to go back to our understanding of what freedom is, what liberty is. And this is one of these words whose meanings have been almost inverted, I think, over time. So the classical conception of liberty is very different from how people often use it today. People use it today as being synonymous with license, with being able to do whatever they want without restriction. So it's basically, I want sort of the unlimited right and ability to pursue my private appetite and will and to enact it. And that's not what freedom is, right? So I'll go back to Plato. Plato talked in the Gorgias dialogue about how a person who makes his appetite his law is basically like a jar full of holes. You can never satisfy it, right? This was in a dialogue with the character of Callicles, who's saying, I want to, the sort of the greatest happiness is to be able to sort of grow your appetites and then fulfill them. And one of the points that Socrates puts to him is, well, what about like itching? Do you want to sort of grow your itchiness and then I'll just always be sort of scratching? And Callicles is like, well, yeah, right. So that's not freedom, right? Freedom is actually, it's the capacity to govern yourself internally. So you don't need external restraint because you have acquired the capacity inwardly to control yourself, to control your appetites, to order your sort of components of your soul such that you are ruled by reason and not your passions. And so that's the kind of freedom that we're talking about. And it's a freedom that is acquired that has to be habituated. And you start in childhood by, yes, imposing structure and providing the parameters in which a person is to act. And children actually love structure. They love rules and they love being able to follow them well. This is a source of real pride, and it makes them much more comfortable. So there's an experiment that was done on a group of kids where they were told to sort of run out into a field, and the field had no fence. So there's no perimeter. It's a huge, vast plain. And when that was the case, the kids actually stayed pretty close together. They were sort of afraid to venture out into this unknown. But when they erected a perimeter fence, the kids explored much further. So actually limits, structure, order, discipline, these things are good for children, and it actually allows them a framework in which they can sort of test their limits safely and more confidently. So when they're children, this is a great time to teach them these habits, to teach them discipline, to impose rules. And then as they grow older, they will have internalized those and they won't need them imposed externally, but they also won't be a slave to their appetites and irrational passions.
All right, there we go back to the classics, that Plato and his appetites and all the rest. It sounds like a lot of great wisdom as we think about the need for rules. I think of, the larger point in society, we need guardrails, and that's why we have constitutions about how we live together in freedom. But it doesn't mean we just do anything we want.
No, certainly not.
All right. Okay, I like your way of thinking, Caylan. So as we get to kind of the tail end of our conversation, and it's been a great one with Caylan Ford, the founder of a number of classic schools. And I've been so appreciative of the audience's questions and comments. Please subscribe, like what we're talking about, share what we're talking about. These are very important issues. And so one of the questions that I think is very interesting that has been brought up by Prairie is the whole question about school vouchers. And it goes to the whole, and you can look at the Frontier website about this as we look at school vouchers, the idea that the money follows the child, not the woke school bureaucracy, is a very interesting policy question. So the question here is, do you think that maybe the parents should be receiving the education funding and let them decide what school they want to enroll their child in, rather than just giving a public school system? So right on. This sounds like Sweden to me, doesn't it, Caylan?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of merit in systems like that. Now, Alberta is very interesting. Alberta probably is the most pluralistic education environment in Canada, where we, in a way, have a kind of de facto voucher system, sort of. So students in private or independent schools receive about 3/5 of the operational funding on a per pupil basis that student would receive in a public or Catholic school. So they're already able to carry at least a portion of that student's allocation with them if they choose to go into a private or independent school. Homeschooling children receive a smaller portion, but they're still getting some. So this idea that money should follow the child is at least partly enacted in Alberta already. I think the big sort of policy challenge when we talk about school vouchers is access to capital, to facilities. This is certainly our biggest challenge in growing our charter school network. It's a big challenge that independent operators face as well.
Well, it sounds like a great policy, and it sounds like that's, again, where parents and so many others can play a major role in moving our society forward. There should be choice for parents. There should be an empowerment model for parents to make the best choices available so they can best serve the interests of their children. And it seems to me that that's a great opportunity to really strengthen Canada as a nation. So, that brings pretty much a close to our conversation today. And Caylan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights on education and advice to parents. So as we look to the next school year, as you look across our nation, what is your hope and vision that will happen in terms of education that will better serve our country? Are there things that you see on the horizon that you're hopeful for?
Well, I'm heartened by some provinces starting to crack down on smartphones, even if I think they don't go quite far enough.
Mhm.
And also by continuing efforts in places like Alberta to have charter schools, to have greater options for independent and private school operators, for different religious schools. We didn't get into that, but there's good research, I think, from Cardis or the Fraser Institute, or maybe both, showing how being able to attend a school that is religiously oriented and aligns with your family's religious orientation improves academic performance, and I think also social and emotional skills. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm sort of hopeful that if somehow the Conservatives in BC pull off a victory, I don't know what the prospects are, but I would hope that they would embrace the charter school model there, for example, as well. As far as what I would really like to see, though, that would make me very optimistic if there was some real movement toward it, it would be changing the way that we educate teachers. I think there are some very good people in teachers' colleges. I met one this morning, actually. It was excellent. I think they're a minority. And I think by and large, our education faculties are mal-educating future teachers on not only what effective pedagogy looks like, but also the kind of philosophical assumptions that benefit students when enacted in the classroom.
Right on. So let's empower parents with choices on the policy front, and let's clean up those teacher education faculties, that's for sure. So Caylan Ford, I really like the way you think about education. I hope it's been very helpful to our audience, and very much appreciate our audience's interaction, and all the very best in terms of your leadership and work as you look to the new school year, and all the best to you.
Thank you, David.
All right, so that brings to a close our conversation with Caylan Ford. I hope you found this to be an interesting conversation. We welcome your comments, and again, like what we're doing. And be sure to join us next week, next Thursday at the same time and same place, as we talk about very important issues again on Leaders on the Frontier. And on behalf of all of us, we wish you a terrific week.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.